Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome to all of us, all of you who have joined us today. This is the second session under the Expanding Frontiers webinar series. Today's talk is titled as Missing in Action, Insights from Public Policy Making in India. We have with us Pranay Kotasthane. He is Deputy Director of the Takshashila Institution and chairs the High Tech Geopolitics Programme. Public finance, technology, geopolitics, and public policy. And he does a lot of cool things, of which include the newsletter on public policy, where he co-writes the Anticipating the Unintended. He also co-hosts a Hindi-Urdu podcast on politics, policy, and technology, which is called the Puliyabaazi. He has co-authored a book called Missing in Action, Why You Should Care About Public Policy, and this talk will draw some of the foundational ideas from this book. So over to you, Pranay. Looking forward to hearing.
All right. I hope I'm audible. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'll begin. Thanks, all of you YSI members for having me. First of all, I'll just say that the podcast name is Puliyabaazi, as in a talk over a puliya. So that's another attempt to take public policy thinking to a larger audience. So I'll just begin by talking about this. This is a talk about our book. So this is a book that I have co-authored with Raghu Jaitley, and the book is largely about public policy stories. And I feel like an imposter here. All of you are economists. I am not, though I hugely admire economists and economic reasoning for public policy. So a lot of our work actually is not about doing RCTs or doing deep research, but actually taking policy thinking and economic reasoning to a larger audience and to bring the public back into public policy. That's sort of what our goal is. And the book also tries to further that aim. So we are not trying to address the policy makers with the book, but the idea was to address the other end of the public policy pipeline, which is the Indian citizens. And sort of we had three goals in mind when we began with. I think the first thing was something that I'm sure animates you as well. The question that why is the Indian state the way it is? Why is it powerful yet ineffective? Why is it well-intentioned yet weak? And why is it ambitious and yet underperforming, right? So those were the paradoxes of the Indian state that sort of motivate a lot of our work. And when we began with, we sort of had three goals in mind. One was the idea that if we take these ideas to a larger amount of people, also try to translate this into various Indian languages, the goal is that probably we'll be able to sharpen our demands from the government. And we thoroughly believe in the Overton window model, right? The idea that what politics delivers is largely a demand-driven result. So if a large number of citizens ask for certain things, politicians have, whether they are of one party or the other party, they will be forced to provide that, right? So it's really important that we as citizens are able to demand things from the government and also distinguish what we shouldn't demand from the government. So that was one goal. The second one was this idea that government shouldn't be able to take us for a ride. There are a lot of things that governments promise, and we are taken in by the promises, and we don't go one step further and try to analyze what will be the unintended consequences of the things that governments are promising, right? So classic example being this idea that many governments in EU and now in India have mandated USB-C charger, for example. So it's important to ask that, there are many good things in life, but should the government be providing us that? And if we get the government to actually provide that, what are the consequences of that is an important question to ask. It's as Alexis de Tocqueville said, it's actually difficult to distinguish the government's counsel from its orders. So it is really, really important for us to understand how our governments shouldn't be our first port of call for anything good that we want. So that is the second goal. And the third one was sort of to improve the policy discourse itself. A lot of discourse in popular media is about intentions and not policy. So we try to distinguish between niyat, which is intention, and niti, which is policy. So there's a big gap between the two, and the idea was, can we talk about that a lot more? So how do we go about doing this? As I said, this is not a book by an IAS officer or a book by economists like you. So the idea was to explain these things through Indian examples and stories. Having learned a public policy, a lot of public policy examples come from outside India, from a context which is very difficult to understand. For police reforms, there'll be the New York Police Department case study. For urban policy reform, people will talk about the BRTS in Bogota, Colombia. But it's very difficult for a common Indian to relate to these examples, right? I mean, how many of us know about Colombia and Bogota? And it's tough to relate. So the idea was, can we give examples which are rooted in the Indian context and examples that most Indians have been a part of? So that was one aim. And the second one is, because this is a light book, we use a lot of Bollywood references and stories to make our point as well. So if nothing else, you will get a great Bollywood watch list after reading this book. So that's sort of one bonus that I can promise definitely from this book. So that was sort of the aim. And we in fact begin the book by this idea. There's a very famous song, ये public है जो सब जानती है, but we actually say that ये public है, public सब नहीं जानती है. That is, the public doesn't know all when it comes to public policy, for the reasons that I mentioned in the beginning. So that is sort of what the book is all about. And what I will do in the next 30-35 minutes is take you through 8 ideas, which I think are the core of this book. So the book is a complex one. I don't think there's one particular idea. There are many ideas. So that's why I thought I'll just probably pick 8 of them, and we could probably discuss in the Q&A on some of them or something else related to public policy. All right, so that's where I'll begin. This is sort of the first idea that the book talks about. And the example that we use is about Olympic medals, and should that India does poorly on Olympic medals count, and should that be the responsibility of the Indian state? And this sort of came into light in 2020, where Neeraj Chopra won India's first ever athletics gold at the Tokyo Olympics. And immediately after this victory, 2 kinds of narratives came into light. One was that he won despite government apathy, and the other one, government was quick to respond that no, we've done a lot for this sector. We have in fact given support worth ₹7 crore between 2016 and 2021 for various projects. And that has led to this sort of Olympic victory. But the crucial thing that people forgot to ask in this was that, why should the government even be an important player in that? Both these story arcs assume that government is sort of the side hero. But the idea is, should the government be even doing this? And our view is that a lot of this thinking comes from a false model of thinking about the state and society. And that is one on the right hand side of the screen, which says that individual is sort of on a continuum between, there is something that the markets provide and something that the state provides. And sort of these are the only 2 elements which can provide things that an individual asks for or wants. But what we say is, actually, this is not this is a sort of a false model about thinking about the state. In fact, there is something called this triangle, which is on the left hand side, which says that individual is actually in the center of 3 different institutions. It's not just that the society is metaphorically a patient on which the state and the markets operate. In fact, society can also be a very active solution provider to a lot of our problems. So it is useful to think of individual in this way, with these three institutions at the corners. And a lot of people have written in recent years. Raghuram Rajan has written on this in the US context, and Rohini Nilekani has written in the Indian context about Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar, which is state, market, and society. So we also talk about this as the starting point, and the idea being that all these three are solution providers. All these three have complementary strengths and complementary weaknesses. The state is great at probably providing security, but the state is really poor at unleashing innovation or allowing an individual to express themselves freely through creative thinking. So that is done by the market, but market is obviously also oblivious to inequity concerns, right? So market allows innovation, a lot of great things to occur, but it won't necessarily be the important concern of inequity reduction. The third one is society. Society again has great strengths in terms of providing a sense of belonging. Also, it can resolve some market failures like Elinor Ostrom's works talks about. But society also can be majoritarian, right? So that is again, there are strengths and weaknesses, and the idea finally is, can we use the advantages of all these three to get optimal results? And that's where we talk about the Olympics example as well. And the Olympics example, medal tally, what we say is, actually, given the constraints of the Indian state, it is unfair to ask for it. In fact, it is not even desirable to ask for the state to focus its limited resources and capabilities on doing something like winning Olympic medals. In fact, this is one area where the society can play a dominant role, and that something that has already happened in this case of the India's first ever athletics gold as well. A lot of things happen through philanthropy, through the role played by philanthropy of corporates, also through philanthropy of organizations and NGOs like the Olympic Gold Quest, and Go Sports Foundation, etc., which invested time and energy into building India's sporting capabilities as well. So this is one framework to think about, and it underpins a lot of our thinking that society is not just a patient on which markets and the state operate. In fact, society in India has also been a solution provider, either through civil society initiatives, social movements, or through philanthropy. And it's useful to unleash the power of society as well while thinking about the role of the state. And we don't need the state to always be our first port of call. Even societies can be powerful change makers. This is sort of the first thought with which we begin the book. The second idea that we sort of come to in the book is about how the Indian state is too big and too small simultaneously, and that is sort of a paradox that underlies a lot of its problems. So the way I put it is that the Indian state is omnipresent and omni-absent simultaneously. And the way we think of it is the paradox can be looked in four terms. So, for example, is the Indian state small in terms of expenditure, or is it big in terms of expenditure? If you look at from a public finance view, Indian state is not an aberration in terms of the amount of expenditure it does. For example, India's overall expenditure as a proportion of GDP in 2018 was around 26-27%. The US is approximately at 38%. Sweden is approximately at 49%. Pakistan is approximately at 21%. So what we see is actually India is not an aberration in that terms. It is relatively small in terms of expenditure as a proportion of GDP. The Indian state, it's just follows largely the Wagner's rule, right? So as societies become rich, the expenditure of the state increases, not decreases. The state starts focusing on fewer things, but starts doing them well. Whereas in the Indian state example, we have 27% spending, now it is around 25%, and yet the Indian state is spread itself too thinly in a wide variety of areas. So you have this paradox that one, the Indian state is actually not small, not very big in terms of expenditure. It largely follows the global trend. What about capacity, right? Now, capacity is something which we know the Indian state lacks. So their Indian state's incompetence in fixing the most basic market failures, from law and order to public health and education, is quite apparent to all Indian citizens as well. And in fact, as soon as people can afford it, Indians prefer to stay away from government-run schools, hospitals, etc. Right, and often the law and order agencies instill fear rather than confidence, and the judicial system is also marred by poor quality and low throughput. So we are clearly small in terms of capacity. Now, what about in terms of the number of people within the state? Here again, actually, the perception in common perception is that the Indian state is bloated, it has too many number of people. But again, there the data doesn't say so, right? So India actually has, if you include all the public sector enterprises and public sector banks under the union government, even so, the size of the Indian union government is half the size of its US counterpart when normalized by population. This is from Devesh Kapoor's excellent paper, Why Does the Indian State Both Fail and Succeed? So clearly we are small in that regard as well. So what is the problem then? Why is the Indian state both omnipresent and omniabsent? The thing is, the real paradox lies in terms of the ambition and the load bearing of the Indian state. So the Indian state is small on the first three counts, but it's really, really big on the ambition and the kinds of things it wants to do, right? So the state sort of always had this aspiration to do a lot of things, and it comes from the outset, from right from the outset, the Indian state attempted to do not just a political and economic revolution, but also a social revolution, in the words of Granville Austin, right? So the idea was that the Indian state will usher a social revolution through the constitution. And this revolutionary DNA was hard-coded into the Indian state, which meant that Indian state set itself really ambitious goals, regardless of the capacity to actually achieve them or on deliver them. And over the decades, the only new goals have been added to this lofty project, and the Indian state is hence everywhere and yet nowhere. So that's where we can see this ambition along all three functions, whether you look at producing, financing, or regulating. As a producer, the Indian state has more than 1,500 government-run enterprises which are trying to manufacture everything from soaps to missiles to steel. And as a financier, the state runs hundreds of programs and schemes. At the height of its power, the union government actually had 360 central sector and centrally sponsored schemes, And finally, when it comes to regulating, there is a lot of data on how there are manufacturing firms needs to comply with over 1,500 laws and over 60,000 compliances and 6,000 filings every year. So this is the central paradox that we talk about in the book, where because of this ambitions, the Indian state has spread itself too thinly, whereas on all the counts that really matter on its delivery, expenditure, capacity, or the people within the Indian state, it is really small. So again, we as Indian citizens need to think deeply whether it is good for the Indian state to be entrusted with even more responsibilities when it can't get the basic things that only the state can do right. So this is another idea that we discussed in the book. The third one, and I'll discuss an example that I really like, is about sandalwood farming in India. So this is again something we talk about now. Property rights is ensuring property rights is really, really important. The work of Amen Alkian talks a lot about this, about how when property rights are secure, the nature of competition changes. Instead of intimidation and trying to usurp another's property, people are forced to actually negotiate and exchange that property once property rights are settled, right? But when the property rights are taken away, really harmful unintended consequences appear. Now, this is theory, but how do you explain it to people, hopefully in a relatable way? So the way we try to do this is to explain this through sandalwood farming and sandalwood costs in India. So this is a really interesting story of state involvement in sandalwood. And actually, if you look at this area, everyone in India has sort of had an experience of how sandalwood is really costly, of either being duped by sandalwood sellers, or even they would have heard of the brigand Veerappan who was involved in sandalwood smuggling. But the link that connects all these is actually state and state taking away property rights. And here's how, so first, price should be an indicator of scarcity of a commodity, but actually sandalwood is not scarce in India. In fact, it is quite abundant. 90% of the world's resources of sandalwood are in 3 Indian states of Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka. And yet we have this paradox where India was producing 4,000 tons in around 1965, and that production had gone to a measly 200 tons in 2019. So what happened? How did this drop happen? And obviously the price rose, and that's why all these smuggling and fake sandalwood emerged. So why did it happen, right? So first, it was due to good intentions and state involvement. In fact, it began in the pre-colonial era. So first, sandalwood was hugely in demand in China, and East India Company wanted to export it. So Tipu Sultan, for example, in Mysore state, stopped trade with Britain and then made sandalwood a royalty in 1792. And this was perfectly out of good intentions that, why should we trade with the British, and British shouldn't take away a precious commodity elsewhere. So that was anyways the logic. But of course, when the Britishers won after the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, Britishers monopolized trade in sandalwood, and that's how the control of state began over this commodity. And that continued after independence. Even after independence, the state monopolized trade in sandalwood. In fact, if sandalwood tree belonged on your land, it grew on your land, it was still a property of the state. You needed a declaration about the number of trees that grew on the state, on your property. A forest officer could enter any private land and cut the trees, and a forest officer was supposed to give 75% of the value as decided by the officer. Landholders were in fact held responsible for damage or theft of any tree, even though they had no exclusive authority over it. Violators could be imprisoned and fined, etc. Further in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, it was necessary to get a license to store, sell, and process sandalwood. Possession of sandalwood in excess of 20 kilograms was made an offense. So these are all real things that happened, and these just show that when you take property rights away, obviously no one started caring for sandalwood. So production fell, price rose, and you saw the production falling down. Smuggling, then the government started producing sandalwood on its own government-owned forests. And obviously then smuggling began on these areas. Forest officers started colluding with smugglers. And that's when Veerappan shifted careers, so to say, from killing elephants for ivory to actually smuggling sandalwood, because that was more profitable. So this is how, sort of a long story and an example to illustrate how when you take property rights away, it leads to really unintended and sometimes even unanticipated consequences. And that is another illustration of a story that I'm sure a lot of Indians at least know about sandalwood, and how it is it costs an arm and a leg to buy real sandalwood, right? So that is one illustration. The next thought we talk about in the book is about economic growth and GDP. And of course, this is not new to you all, but again, this is a point I think that needs to be made a lot in common perceptions, where a lot of concerns are about inequality, etc. And we jump to that without illustrating the importance of economic growth and GDP in a country of India's GDP, and largely in any other country in the subcontinent as well, right? So economic growth matters and still matters a lot, given where we are. So we talk a lot about this in the book as well. There's a chapter where we discuss various factors of economic growth, and the fact that even if we want the state to achieve myriad of other goals, we still need a high economic growth in order to achieve the other goals as well, whether it is inequality reduction or combating climate change, etc. We still need a tremendous amount of economic growth to deliver results on the other things we want the state to deliver as well. So, I mean, these are some papers that we cited, but I'm not going to read through them, but the whole idea again they talk about is how economic growth is really important even for many social progress indicators, which are non-economic in nature. And even if you want to deliver that, you need high economic growth. Similarly, for inequality as well, there's a lot of study which says that most of world's inequality is between countries, not within countries. And so inequality reduction has to be an overwhelmingly national task. And if that is the case, then redistribution cannot be the only solution, because if our income levels and the size of the economic pie is just so small, even doing a huge amount of redistribution is not going to help, because we are not going to have the amount of resources which we require to even increase the total economic base of the country. So that is sort of one more important idea that we want to just emphasize when we talk about public policy. So this is the fourth thought. I'll move to the fifth one, and this is about taxes, right? And there is a very common idea again in Indian public policy thinking, that tax system and just modifying the tax system endlessly is an effective instrument for redistribution, and Robin Hood taxes sort of can help a lot, and you can just transfer money. You can have very progressively charged income tax slabs, or you can have new wealth taxes, and miraculously that will lead to transfer of wealth to the lower income sections of the society. And that's why tax system is used for a variety of purposes. If you see any income tax filing and income tax return, it's complicated because the tax system is being used for what I call hyper multi-objective optimization. So the tax system is used to do everything from backward region development to providing incentives of many types, etc. So what we again emphasize is that all the things that you want to do for providing economic support, etc., are best done on the expenditure side and not on the revenue side. So the tax system should be as simple as possible, broaden the base, lower the rates, as public finance economists called. So the aim should be to collect as much tax as possible from a large number of people at lower rates. And when that is possible, you can do a lot of things on reduction of inequality, providing economic support on the expenditure side, right? So, and this is also illustrated from the experience of US and Europe as well, where the US has a very progressive income tax structure, more so than in the EU, and yet you have a result where inequality is lower in EU compared to the US. And the result, it is also because a lot of things are done in the EU on the expenditure side, which are better, rather than thinking a lot about the tax side, right? So that is again an idea that we emphasize, where we need to go beyond thinking about tax policy as a solution to resolving all our problems. And that is one key reason why doing business in India is very difficult, because tax policy has been used to achieve way too many goals than it possibly can. This is the sort of the fifth thought. The sixth thought is about price controls. I mean, we talk endlessly about how price controls are really, really terrible, and that there are many, many examples of that in the book, which we try to explain. So I'll just talk about a few examples on this. So minimum support price is not a price cap, but it is definitely a price signal. And that again, there's a causal connection between how the minimum support price is related to the Delhi smog. And this has been written by Ashok Gulati, who's a well-known agricultural economist, and he talks about how the MSP is related to Delhi smog, right? So I'll just explain that causal chain. Again, it's an interesting example to talk about. So we know how the Delhi smog happens every year, and there is evidence to say that at least one of the causes for the Delhi smog is the stubble burning of crop residue, which happens in states like Punjab, Haryana, UP, etc. Right. So the question is that it happens, but few people think that actually this is also related to the minimum support prices. And here's how, right? So first, we know that Delhi smog is caused by crop residue being burned on many farms simultaneously over a really short time period, so that the farms can be cleared to sow wheat in the first week of November. So that should make us ask that why can't the burning of crop residue be done in a staggered manner, right? Such that this problem doesn't occur. But turns out that is not possible, because the Kharif crop, which is the paddy, is sown only after June 15. And this leads to a delayed output, leaving farmers with a very little time to clear the field for the next crop. And hence all of them burn this simultaneously, and that leads to this problem of crop burning, and hence the contribution to the smog. But that should lead us to ask the next question, why can't paddy crop be sown earlier, before June 15? And that's where the government as a protagonist comes in. In fact, the government of Punjab had passed Punjab Preservation of Subsoil Water Act in 2009, which prohibits paddy transplantation before June 15. And if this rule is violated, paddy nurseries can be destroyed, and repeated violators can also lead to disconnection of electricity supply, of offending farmers, etc. So that can be a huge inconvenience for them. So that should again ask us the question, what explains these rules, right? Why is the government prohibiting paddy cultivation before June 15? Now, turns out the ban is intended to save water during the peak summer season. And paddy farms apparently need a lot more water in April as against June, because of higher evaporation in summer months. So that's why this has been prevented. Now, this in turn should make us ask, why are farmers growing rice in a water scarce area in the first place, right? And to which the answer is that is the price signal, which we know in India as the minimum support price, right? So MSP is again a government assured minimum price guarantee on the sale of particular crops, and the assured procurement of rice by the government over incentivizes overproduction of rice, even in areas which are not well suited to the crop. So this is the link. And of course, we can't be too smug in this uncovering this connection. MSP was introduced at a time when India was struggling with food shortages. So the government thought it would be a good idea to incentivize farmers by producing a minimum procurement threshold price. But the way it was done is without any sort of sunset clause. There were subsidies also on the input side through the Green Revolution, which were great. But having a policy like this MSP, which had no endpoint defined, led to this downstream consequence where rice is still being grown in an area and causing a lot of environmental consequences there, but also affecting other areas which are not connected to the rice growing regions itself, right? So, I mean, economists now talk about, can we have Gaussian solutions to actually resolve this, right? But this is still a problem which exists, and this is a nice connection to illustrate how price fixing can have disastrous consequences. Also, there's another very interesting example about how if people in India, if they would have booked flight tickets during 2021, 2022 COVID periods, they would have found out this very peculiar situation where all flight tickets were of different airline operators were actually showing the same price if you were trying to book tickets during COVID period. And that was because government had this brilliant idea of having a price floor, a price cap, and also a capacity cap at the same time for various reasons. And we illustrate how that sort of had disastrous consequences, and it couldn't lead to a downfall of another airline, which happened in recent times. So again, we try to talk about that. And then there's a very nice movie as well called Mohan Joshi Hazir Ho. Again, a good movie if you haven't seen it. And that actually talks about how rent control has led to disastrous consequences. In fact, the book actually doesn't talk about this directly. The book talks about the same idea in which is most commonly stated, that there are these rapacious, unscrupulous landlords in Mumbai who are looting all the tenants, and that is why tenants are in permanent difficulties. But the movie obviously doesn't talk about how the real problem is with rent controls and the which were introduced in Bombay, the then Bombay, and that led to a lot of things downstream, where we had no incentive for any landlord to do upkeep and maintenance of the places that they owned. And because of those rent controls, in fact, you had a situation where there were many places which became unsafe, unhygienic, and they led to these consequences. And actually Mumbai lost out a lot, and it priced itself out because of high cost and low provision of additional housing and business land supply. So that is again one thing that we sort of refer to the movie, but we tell how it got the lesson completely wrong, and again illustrate the importance of price caps and how price caps lead to these consequences. The sort of the seventh thought and the second last thought that we discuss in the book is how pro-business policies are easy and seductive. Governments often deploy them, but again, they also have long-lasting and harmful unintended consequences. And the example we used to illustrate is how India missed the electronics manufacturing bus in the 1980s, and now we are trying to catch up with it. In fact, many people would not know that in India we had a policy called the items reserved for the manufacture exclusively by the small scale sector. This was a policy introduced at the height of the license Raj to boost employment growth in India's small manufacturing establishment. So the policy said that only firms which were considered to be small scale industries were allowed to manufacture a reserved list of items. And obviously, as you can imagine, in 1967, this began with a small list of only 47 items. By 1978, this pro-business policy had expanded to 504 reserved items. And by 1997, this number had reached over 1,000, which even included many electrical and electronic goods. So obviously, you can imagine, and by small sector, they meant that there were very strict controls on the amount of machinery you can employ. There were strict controls on the labor to machinery ratios, etc. And that led to India not being able to scale some of the businesses in these sectors, and in fact, there's a lot of work by economists on this. And when this policy was finally removed in 2015, we had a natural experiment where you could measure how this dereservation impacted. And in fact, Harrison, Martin, and Natraj, they have a paper on this, and where they found that once the sector was dereserved, the number of establishments making that product increased by 15%, employment increased by 50%, and output increased by 35%, capital increased by 45%, and wages increased by 6% in those very sectors, right? So clearly, and in fact, they find that young establishments and not small establishment exhibit high employment growth. So it is really important for many more firms to germinate rather than focusing on keeping them small and having them forcefully employ more people. So that was one reason why India lost out in a lot of manufacturing, including in electronics assembly, etc. at that time. So this was this idea, and this, of course, we emphasize using Arvind Subramaniam and others' work on the difference between pro-business policies and pro-market policies. And the idea is we should focus more on pro-market things, where a lot of work still needs to be done, whereas the government again is focused on a lot of pro-business policies. The recent one being production-linked incentives, which have again spawned from a few critical sectors to 14 different sectors, where the government wants to introduce various sorts of pro-business incentives without fixing some of the underlying market disincentives which exist for many sectors at large. So this is the 7th point, and the 8th one, and I'll end here, is again this idea, and there's a chapter largely written by my co-author on this idea of this simplistic assumption which people have in India about the Kerala model versus the Gujarat model, right? These are thought of as two opposing ends of development models, saying that the Kerala model is largely about the state running a lot of things, and that's why it has done so well on human development indicators, whereas the Gujarat model is approximated as a model where the market has a very big role to play. But in fact, we write about in the book that actually those two models are not that very different, and in fact, better policies in both states have largely had similar reasons rather than differences. So for example, India's first new age world-class airport is the Kochi airport, and that was the Cochin International Airport Limited. The owning company was not a public sector unit. In fact, the government of Kerala owned a percentage of the company, while the rest was owned by individuals, banks, and companies. So clearly, it was not the state doing a lot of things. In fact, also, while it is true that Kerala has the largest number of state PSUs in India, around 130, Gujarat ranks just 3rd on this list. It has 86 companies. So not much difference in that regard as well. Also, the successes of Kerala also, we need to acknowledge the role of markets there as well. For example, nurses from Kerala are a common sight across hospitals in India. But what is less understood is that of the nursing colleges in college seats in Kerala, around 17,600, more than 90% of them are in private colleges, not in government-run colleges. Similarly, education in Kerala is talked about a lot, but again, a lot of success there is due to aided schools run by missionary organizations, etc., and not necessarily by government-run schools. So the role of government was financing, not producing education. So again, things that are important to realize, which get missed in these ideal types of trying to differentiate between how the Kerala and Gujarat models are on two opposing ends, whereas many of the successes probably have similar reasons. So these were sort of the 8 thoughts that we discussed in the book. And even though the book is largely about policy failures, we are very hopeful about India. The book was aimed to cast a critical eye on the way Indian state functions for an Indian citizen, with the hope that the Indian state will then hold this state accountable for the things that the state should only the state can provide, whether it's law and order, improving public health, or at least financing education, etc., etc. Right. So those were the things that we wanted to end on. And the good thing is a lot of the solutions of this remain in the domain of control and influence of the state. And a lot of good things have also happened over the last 70-75 years as well. That's why we are here. That's why a lot of poverty has also been reduced in India. So we end with that note that Aati Rahengi Bahare, which means there are many more springs to come. And the hope just is that whether we can improve and deliver on the potential that the Indian state promises itself. So with that, I will stop. And if there are any talks or questions or comments, we can discuss them. Thanks, Nisha.
Thank you so much, Pranay. It's so refreshing to see citations of songs and movies rather than, papers and books. So we will give some time for our audience to frame their questions. Meanwhile, I have just a clarificatory question or something I want your opinion on. We always talk about state capacity, but in the pyramid, there is also society and there's also markets. So what are your thoughts on developing the capacity of the society to provide for the individual better as well as for the markets? So what's your take on building capacities for the other two components of the triangle?
Yeah, no, I mean, great question. But obviously, like, markets and states are something that are largely well understood, and we endlessly discuss about market failures. So we know there are certain challenges in that, and how do you improve that, etc. But that's the third end of that tripod, is what we know so little about, right? How do we build societal capacity, right? And what are the necessary elements to that? So for example, there's a lot of work on social capital, right? Building social trust. How does that happen? What are the things which are blocking that? Those are things where very little work is done. So for example, some work has already been done by Elinor Ostrom, and in terms of how societies can govern common pool resources, right? But beyond that, there is still a lot more work that needs to be done in the localized context, right? Like what Ostrom also writes, a lot of these things are context specific. So you need to understand how social capital is built in India, in our areas. How can we build more social capacity? How can we build more trust? I think trust is the base element on which you can build societal capacity to work. So that is again things that are very seldom discussed, and that's where a lot of energy needs to go in terms of thinking how we can make the society work better to achieve some of these goals. So yeah, societal. The other area of thinking on this is also about social norm and behavioral change, right? So for example, Christina Bicchieri's work, Social Norms in the Wild, talks about how social norm change happens, how empirical expectations and normative expectations change. So again, a lot more work needs to be done in that area to understand how social norms can change in India. I think Swachh Bharat Mission was one policy where they tried to use some of these elements to think about social norm and behavioral change. But that is again an element to think of more deeply about changing social norms and building societal capacity. And the third element of this also is just in terms of thinking about the bigger collective, right? Bigger us, which is a capital US, right? How do we build a larger community of people who are thinking about not just their own area or their own private benefit, but also about a larger community benefit, right? There's a balance required between Swartha and Parartha, as we teach it, right? Between self-interest and between others' interest. So how do we strike that balance? So these are all, like, as you can see, I don't have great answers to this because these are a lot of questions that we haven't thought through deeply. There's a lot of focus on state failure, market failure, but a lot of our current predicaments are because of societal failures. And that's where a lot more energy needs to go in if we want to resolve some of the problems.
Okay, so now I'm asking the audience if they have a question, they can unmute themselves and pose it directly. They can also just type it out in case they feel there's a lot of background noise or their connectivity is really poor. So is there anybody in the audience who would like to pose a question? Okay, we have Firdaus who, yes, Firdaus, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for having this wonderful session. I would first like to, thank you, YSI, for organizing such a wonderful, session on missing role of the state. I'm having, two important queries that we are talking about three dimension, economy, or we can say state, where there is role of state, society, and market. So if we try to understand the public policy failure, who is the most responsible, stakeholder or the agency, to talk about that they are directly responsible for, insignificant public policy in India. My second question I have, write down it in the chat box, that as you were, at the end, you were comparing that Kerala and Gujarat, that private machinery schools, they are, producing good output. So if we try to, there is, a lot of debate going on that government sector or government institutions, they are having the manpower which is highly skilled and highly qualified. So why we are lacking, significant output when government is, providing sufficient funding or supporting public policy programs via government institutions? Why they are, failing, and why privatization is, improving with lack of funders? They do not have too much resources. So how to cover up this gap and why it is like this? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Firdaus. Just a couple of points on this. So on your first question, who to hold primarily responsible? I mean, of course, the state is a very important element in a democratic republic like ours. So the state has to be held responsible for a lot of failures on many counts, right? But it's also important, I think, to realize that not all of the failures are just state failures. A lot of our failures are also social failures, right? Like, I mean, caste system, for example, is a social failure. So a lot of solutions for that will also have to come from the society if we are to change that. The state can legislate, the state can say some things will not go, should go away, but whether they'll go away or not will also depend on how the other two elements of that tripod work. So that is really one thing to remember. So that not all failures are market failures or government failures. There are also very important social failures. Another social failures, which you all know better than me, is the low women's labor force participation in India, right? It's not necessarily a state failure or a market failure. It is also, there are deep social reasons for that. So the locus of solutions for these kinds of problems will lie at the intersection of state, market, and society. So this is the point I would like to make. The second question you had, the way I think about it is actually the capacity in the state is often lacking on some of these things. It's just the way we approach this, right? So in education, for example, people have talked a lot about incomes, outputs, and outcomes, right? And a lot of focus is in the Indian state has been on the inputs. So how many teachers we should provide, or how many buildings are there, etc. But there is very little focus on the outcomes when the state is producing this. So a lot more focus on, the state can actually finance. It's fine, can provide finance for primary education. People have talked about vouchers, etc. But as long as the incentives are not aligned towards producing great outcomes, which is often the case when there is a government school, it leads to adverse outcomes. So you would want the state to now focus on the ASER reports, which are coming out every year and highlighting how there are learning outcomes gaps, and not focus so much on the inputs, but focus on outputs and outcomes. And when we start thinking of that model, we will start thinking of, financing rather than producing education from the state side. So that's where I'll sort of stop. Thanks.
We can take one more question. If somebody wants to unmute, and they can go ahead and pose the question to Pranay. Okay, so I'll ask the last question since nobody's coming forward. What is your take on the intersection of the political economy in state capacity failure for India? So you have a lot of, there is firstly this democracy part wherein every 5 years there's a change, right? So the party that comes into power will have a different way of working. It has different objectives as opposed to what was its previous party or the government was. So how do you think that intertwines with the state failing again and again? Do you think political will and political economy has in what way is that responsible?
Yeah, I think political economy does play a role, but not just in electoral terms. Like I will also go one step further and ask for more quotidian things, right? So for example, police state capacity or policing capacity in India, right? Now, every state is understaffed on this. If they actually staff more police personnel, it can also be a political economy win for the people in power, right? Government jobs are in huge demand in India, so that can happen. And yet, on a lot of police departments in India are actually understaffed, right? So the political economy question for this is not just about electoral contingencies, but it is even more deeper, right? Maybe there are caste considerations which are coming in the way. Maybe there are other reasons which are leading to this understaffing of policing, right? So this is an example which sort of I wanted to highlight, which says that the political economy problems run deeper than just about electoral demands, right? That is there in every democracy, right? So it's not peculiar to India, and that we see in India like in other states as well. Like the most big changes happen in the first 2-3 years of the government. Thereafter, the governments wouldn't want to do things towards towards the end of their term, etc. But that's not peculiar to India. A last element, Anisha, I would add probably of a political economy challenges the institutions we had for intergovernmental negotiations have weakened significantly. That is one problem that I can see. For example, you have this case currently of the some states going back to the old pension scheme, right? That a great reform in India was the new pension scheme, etc., which led to control in our pension burden. But now a lot of states are moving towards this old pension scheme, which will be very disastrous for the debts and deficits of states, and obviously then it will have its impact on capital expenditure. But that is happening I think also because there are the institutions which do bargaining, negotiation between union and state governments, like the interstate council. Also, planning commission used to do that to a certain extent. Those aren't doing that role. So we have this peculiar political economy thing that now states want to do things which might be popular in the short term, but will obviously be hurtful to their own citizens and their own state residents in the long term. So GST Council was an example where there was some intergovernmental bargaining which happened in one way, but that needs to now expand beyond indirect tax to a lot of these expenditure decisions or revenue decisions, and that I think is still missing.
Yeah, so Firdaus, you can have the last question.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. My point is a bit, crucial with respect to political economy of our country, and it is related to politics. In every sector, we are witness that there are innovations and there is larger changes going on, whether it is skill, whether it is manpower, update. So, but because of democracy, we are having, I think this is one of the bad points of democracy, that everybody can contest the election, whether it is educated, whether it is illiterate or any. So do you think that, what is your take on this, that our politicians or MLAs or parliamentarians, there should be some, minimum education as the pace is going on. New rules and regulations are, passed. New bills are, coming there. Do you think, to make our political system or political economy more better, so that there will be, good policies for the public? So for that, there should be some minimum, education qualification, so that they can, work more effectively for the public. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks, Firdaus. Actually, I don't think so. I don't think that is the central problem, because see, the way I would see it, the role of a politician would be, one, to be able to understand things and to be able to actually negotiate and do coalition building, which is the role. And that doesn't require, no degree teaches you that, right? It is actually people, they know about, every politician in India would say knows a lot more about Indian citizens and Indian public than me or you, because they are with the people, they know how to make negotiations and settlements happen, which is the role of a politician. The goal of whether a particular policy, a great and cost benefits, etc., are finally to be done by bureaucrats, to be explained to a large number of people, etc. So that is not the central challenge. I would just modify your contention by saying actually the central problem is the role of political parties. The political party as an institution has grown a lot over the last 50, 60 years compared to how it was envisioned in the constitution, right? So now if you look at the anti-defection law, which came in 1985, after that, any MP, MLA is actually just a member of a political party. It is MP stands for member of political party rather than member of parliament. So that is the central problem, that no MP is sort of going to represent the interests of their constituents when you have whips being that can be issued. The term itself, whip, is, I mean, why do we even have it in a democracy? But that exists, and the political party has grown in scope, in its power as an institution in the Indian state. And that, I think, is a bigger challenge, and that is the reason why we are not probably getting the results that we would want. And that is something we write in the book as well, and highlight this central problem according to us. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to be a politician and take back my words and say last question, because we have two more hands coming up. So we'll have Anushri and then Vikram. All right, Anushri, go ahead, ask your question.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. My question is, as a policy process, like you have a, we have an input, output, and an outcome, and that requires a good amount of, a good gestation, right? Even to have a better outcome, right? With the current kind of innovation that is happening and the technological disruption. So, what's your take on, like, how would this policy process would it require speeded you know um, speeding process, and how do you think in future this entire process would probably reduce, or yeah.
Yeah, Anushri, I think the way I would think about this is that finally you need quicker feedback loops and negative feedback loops in order to stabilize a system, right? So that is a general framework to think about being able to reduce the time between gauging inputs impact on outputs and outputs impact on outcomes. So the way it is done in technology policy, for example, is by introducing sandboxes, or in older policy areas, we would call it pilot studies, right? So these are ways in which you're trying to quicken understanding the impact of inputs on outputs and outcomes, so that you have negative feedback loops, you understand what is going wrong, what is going right in a smaller or in a more controlled environment before unleashing the policy into the wild, right? So that's how these sandboxes are done. A lot of those, for example, there are sandboxes now for the digital marketplaces. There are sandboxes for the new health ID that they were trying to develop. So a lot of those are trying to quicken this understanding and impact of inputs on outputs and outcomes. So that these are the ways to go ahead, I guess.
All right. Because I've already asked for extra time from you, Pranay, so we're going to take Bikram's question now. Bikram, go ahead.
Hi, Pranay. Yeah, thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation, though I have only attended the last part. My question is, like, you talked about the policy failures, and one thing we see in the policy failure is also that because of the policy inaction, and no policies are made by the parties or the elected representatives, but it's a bureaucrats who are the main players in implementation. And there has, like, how do you see in the policy failure the role of bureaucracy in that sense? Like, if we have seen our writings where the bureaucrats creates a problem rather than even the implementation or in the providing the last mile services. So how you see the role of bureaucracy and how efficient Indian bureaucracy is to, like, fulfill the policy needs, or the what are the policy commitments?
Yeah, thanks, Vikram. I think a central challenge that I said in the beginning was that we have low state capacity on this. In fact, as I was citing a paper which said that even if you include all public sector employees of the union government, the Indian states, the federal government size is still half that of the US government when normalized to population. So the one central thing is we just don't have enough people in the important roles, right? You take a classic example of the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology now. Just look at the kinds of things they are doing and the impact on the Indian economy. Semiconductors, Digital India Act, data protection, a whole lot of things. And what is the capacity that they have in terms of the bureaucrats and the number of people working? Very less, so these are, I would say MeitY is probably the third most important union government ministry today after finance and defense, and yet it is so understaffed that there is a big challenge here, right? So that is, I think, a challenge that we have. The other thing I would also say is that there are a lot of failures which are not just implementation failures, they are also theory of change failures, and they underlie because our thinking about how policy change happens is also a bit broken. So I'll stop with that. There's more about it in the book.
All right. So I think we come to the close of our talk with Pranay. Thank you so much for taking out the time and talking with us. I hope you had a good time interacting with the young scholars, the South Asia Working Group. And we will keep you posted with the upcoming talks under the Expanding Frontiers. Stay tuned. Thank you, Pranay. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. See you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.